We'll start the evening, and people will still be joining. So first of all, I want to welcome everyone who's joined us this evening. We are, I think this is the 7th meeting in this series, which started out as a leadership training for the leaders in our communities around Europe, but it's expanded now, and I was just going through our lists today, and amazingly, over the course of the 7 sessions that we've done, we've had over 300 different people involved at one stage or another in these lectures. We're in the 3rd unit, and we're looking at the world around us. And we all know that we build our communities in a wider environment. Depending on the country we are, that environment, sometimes it's friendly, sometimes it's less friendly. We have different relationships with the governments around us, but also the social scene is changing. And that hugely impacts on our community and on our plans for the future. And we've dedicated 3 sessions to how the world around us is changing and to thinking about how we need to respond as community leaders to that changing world. Last time we looked at changes that are taking place in Europe, and this time we're going across the ocean and we're looking at the American Jewish community and the trends and the developments and things that are happening in the American Jewish community. The American Jewish community, of course, is the largest Jewish community in the largest diaspora community. And what happens in America has an impact and influences all of us. And we're interested in knowing what's happening in America, not only because we're interested in knowing what's happening in America, but with a sense that things that happen in America have a way of moving out and impacting all parts of the Jewish world. The session this evening, the format is kind of interview. I see it as kind of a TV interview style where you sit around with the moderator in the living room and he asks questions of the guests. We have 2 special guests this evening, Rabbi Jacob Blumenthal, who's the CEO of the United Synagogue of America and also the Rabbinical Assembly, and Rabbi Lisa Grant, who is the director of the rabbinical program at HUC New York. But I'm not going to say any more about them. Our moderator this evening is Rabbi Zagoria Moffat, who's at St. Albans Massorti, and is a friend and a colleague of mine, and an opportunity for us to get to know him. And I'm going to turn over to Adam, and Adam's going to invite the other guests into his living room, and he's going to have a conversation with them. If you have questions during the talks, please put them in the chat, and we'll address them later on in the evening to the extent that we have time. And I want to remind people that there's simultaneous translation going on into Spanish and into French. At the bottom of your screen, there should be a button that says interpretation. And if you click on that, you can choose what language you want to hear. Our choices this evening are English, Spanish, and French. So with no further ado, I'm handing over to Rabbi Adam, and please introduce yourself and start with the program.
Thank you. It's not just a joke, the inviting into a living room this evening, because I'm literally in my living room, as many of us are, and it wouldn't be normally the case that I have the privilege of having Rabbi Blumenthal or Rabbi Grant in my living room, as my living room is now in St. Albans in England, but I'm from the States myself and graduated JTS some years ago, have the privilege of working here in the UK. So I think perhaps I was eager to help in articulating this understanding of how America affects the rest of the world, because something very close to my heart, certainly having been trained in the States and working now in Europe. I just wanted to say a little bit more, but actually invite both Jacob and Lisa to join us, and who are going to introduce themselves briefly and then share a few minutes about what they see as the trends in American Judaism right now and the ones that are likely to impact the world in the future. Because as Rabbi Wiener says, it is the case that often what happens in America happens later in the rest of the world in similar and interesting ways. And then we're going to have the opportunity to discuss and to pose some questions about what it is that's going on and how we can understand more. And there's no two people better to address that than these two. As Rabbi Wiener said, Rabbi Grant is the director of rabbinical program at HUC-JIR in New York, which is the primary Reform seminary. And she has teaching and research interests in not only how we develop Jewish leaders, something close to our heart, but the place of Israel in American Jewish life. And has published widely on these topics as well, trained in Michigan and Ann Arbor and in Amherst at JTS and HUC, an honor not too many people can claim, having gone both uptown and downtown, and it's a privilege to welcome her here this evening. So she's going to start off, Lisa, if you don't mind, by telling us and sharing with us a little bit about where you see American Judaism right now and where it's going.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Chaim, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you this evening. I did prepare a brief little presentation that maybe will be helpful in us framing the conversation. Oh, we have another University of Michigan alum with us. Yeah, it's definitely, and I'm very proud of all my alma maters, almo's mater, I don't know how you say that, and the fact that I did study both uptown and downtown is definitely a key part of who I am and how I see the world as a Jew and as a human being. So I'm going to share my screen and give you this brief little overview of where I see things in American Jewish life today. And I'm not talking about movement here. I'm just talking about general trends in American Jewish life. So as Adam says, I am a rabbi and I'm also a researcher. And much of my research has focused on Jews and Jewish learning in particular, adult Jewish learning, which I think is very representative of where the Jewish community is, what they're interested in, what motivates them to engage, whether it's informal learning or informal learning. And a piece of research, I wanted to start with a piece of research that I began that I did almost, 5.5, almost 6 years ago, where I noted that where we were in the midst of a significant shift in orientation from literacy, Jewish literacy, to Jewish meaning making. That a lot of adult learning programs that predated the 2015 that started in the 90s, the Wexner Heritage Program for Adult Jewish Leadership, MEA out of Boston Hebrew College, the Florence Melton Mini School, these 2-year substantive programs of Jewish learning, and many spin-offs of those were very much literacy focused, and we moved away from that to more of a question of meaning making, not an outward, you don't know enough, you Jewish leaders, you need to know more, but more an inward drive. How can Jewish learning, how can Jewish engagement make my life more meaningful? How can it shape me as a human being? And I think we began to see that shift taking place in the early teens, and I think it is now in full force. This has had a tremendous impact on organizations, both legacy organizations, synagogues, federations, existing structures, and the emergence of many new kinds of organization structures and partnerships, all kinds of different settings, much more personalized and much more customized, much more individualized, what I call boutique learning. I have a particular interest in Jewish environmentalism. Well, there's an organization for that. I have a particular interest in Jewish meditation. There are dozens of organizations for that. I am interested in Musar. There are multiple organizations in that many very customized approaches to Jewish engagement. I'm a queer Jew. There's organizations for that. I'm a Jew of color, and so on and so forth. So we see that as sort of the broad scope of the landscape. Now, what has happened in the age of COVID?
Qu'est-ce qui se passe maintenant
I think overall we can say that this time of pandemic, this almost 1 year, has intensified and accelerated changes that were already in place, in process, and things that we might have taken 10 to 15 years to evolve are going to happen, already have happened, and will continue to happen at a much more rapid pace. As a result, while we're still in the midst of this, and as a result of it, when we come out of it, it's not going to be the same as it was in so many different ways. So we've seen, here we are. I said to my husband a few minutes ago, I'm going to Berlin in a few minutes. We have global access. We've seen multiple mergers of congregations. We've seen all kinds of new communities emerge. Some of which are home-based. There's a whole network within within North America called the Emergent Jewish Network. Now, some of those won't survive. The home-based communities are particularly suffering right now because they're home-based and people can't go into each other's homes. We've seen, this is a fascinating one, this equal access, not just for people with different abilities and disabilities or age, but just the equalization of the space. So I'll give you an example. My weekly Torah study, in the before times, we got about 25 people who would come on a Shabbat morning to study Torah, because that's about all the room would really fit. And the first 15 or so could fit around the table, and the rest were in the back, sort of scrunched in, sitting on counters, maybe sitting on the floor. It was very tight and cozy. Now, we have consistently get 45 people to come, and everybody has their space. Everyone has a square, and we now have new norms about participation. It's not the people around the table who get to speak first. So that's a form of equal access that I think is really interesting, and the question is, will that continue once we are out of this pandemic? We also see all of these needs, back to the boutique and the personalization and the meaning making. So we've seen a lot of responses in that in this way, with in terms of clergy seeking ways, since people aren't coming to them, we have to go to the people. And how do we do that? Through intimate connections. There's a synagogue in New York that has I think a twice weekly coffee with clergy, where you come into people's living rooms like we're simulating today. And those kinds of more proactive engagement with the community is lots and lots of creativity that we're seeing there. We're also seeing a lot more cross-organization collaborations when it comes to sacred music, when it comes to guest speakers. Central Synagogue a few months ago invited Delphine Hoveyeux from Paris to come and give the drasha. So that kind of thing, or a guest from Jerusalem can pop into your synagogue. So the world is open to us. I couldn't. This is the middle of the semester. I couldn't have flown to Europe to give this talk, but here I am in the middle of my day. So that kind of collaboration. So I pose this question: is this our new temple, Zoom? Or is it a temporary mishkan? Is it something that we use while we're in the wilderness, and we'll lovingly leave it to the side while we build something else? Or is this something that will become lasting and endure? That's the big question. So then we have beyond the synagogue so many different, and this is just a taste of the kinds of access to Jewish life, Jewish experience that is out there, and people are participating by the hundreds and the thousands. So I've already mentioned some of these. I think I'm fascinated by this new social media. I have no idea what it is, but TikTok. A number of my students are already creating TikTok personalities and TikTok rabbis. I'm not sure what that means, except that they have an electronic presence that is driving thousands of people. I have other students who have created virtual communities across the United States. They're sitting in, one's sitting in Northern California, another sitting in Washington, D.C. I mean, they're all over the place this year because we're all virtual. And they're creating these communities of people, seekers who are interested in learning and engaging in Jewish life. And they're also all over. And this do-it-yourself Judaism, so many resources and materials out there for people who don't want to affiliate, who don't want to connect in a structured way with the community, but do want to engage in Jewish life. There's plenty out there for people to explore. So yesterday I went onto Facebook, and this was what popped up into my feed, just to give you a taste of what I see, all of the varieties. So this week, the Hadar Rising Song Institute is giving a musical Tu B'Shvat. Also Shabbat Shira, Professor Dalia Marks, who's a colleague of mine who teaches in HUC Jerusalem. She's giving a shiur on Shabbat Shira. We have 40 years, and this was on Sunday, 40 years in Yiddish land. This is upcoming, but 929 and Yeshivat Hadar are collaborating, an example of collaboration to do a program on the Psalms. So those are the examples of the kinds of activities that are all over the place that people have access to in exciting ways that also compete with the rootedness of Jewish life in a particular community and around a particular building or a particular set of clergy. That's the change and the challenge that we are facing. So my questions are, what's next? I mean, these are the questions we're all asking. How will we gather? And there's no one answer to any of these. How will we care for one another? And how will we learn? And how will we lead? So I hope that those are some of the questions that we can begin to explore as the conversation continues. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Lisa. That's a great set of questions to get us started. And before we dive into thinking a little bit more about them in depth together, want to invite Rabbi Blumenthal as well to share some thoughts initially about the direction American Judaism is going and some particular streams or elements of it that might peek out. Rabbi Wiener introduced Rabbi Blumenthal before, but I think it deserves repeating, actually, because there's something about who you are, Rabbi Blumenthal, that's already, I think, a trend and one that's been addressed already this evening. You're both the chief executive of the Rabbinical Assembly and the CEO of the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. To my knowledge, that's a first. These organizations are blending, merging, partnering, different languages being used, perhaps, and that's already exceptional. And typical or atypically, prior to coming into that institutional framework, Rabbi Blumenthal was the founding rabbi of a small synagogue, Shaarei Torah, in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and it began with 25 families and is now 300. So I think he knows something about how to grow and how to develop even a small community, in addition to his now much bigger one. So a pleasure to have you with us this evening, Jacob, and happy for you to share a few words about what you see as the future.
Thanks, Adam, and thank you, Lisa, for really a very helpful presentation, putting a lot of things into context and framing a lot of great questions for us. And what I will say, in many cases, will dovetail, will connect very well, and to the context that you've already provided. I do want to back up and look. I thought what Chaim said about us working within a much larger context is very important, especially for us as conservative Jews, because we understand that our
Le
Judaism
contexte, c'est très
evolves
important,
out of a
surtout pour
certain
nous,
time and
les
place and
Massortis,
cultural
parce
context. It's
qu'on
what
comprend que
has allowed
notre
Judaism to
judaïsme
survive and thrive for the
évolue
past 2,000-3,000 years. So
dans un
it's a
contexte
great way to speak
toujours
about it. And
et
so in the
depuis des
larger
milliers
context,
d'années.
here in
Dans un
North America, but
contexte
especially in
plus
America, and
global,
I'm
plus
speaking to
large,
you from outside of
surtout
Washington,
en
D.C.,
Amérique du Nord, moi
in
je
Maryland,
vous parle du Maryland, qui
the
est
issues
juste en
around
dehors de Washington,
anti-Semitism
D.C.
and our physical
Des
security
questions
have
de
become
l'antisémitisme
one
et de
focus
notre
in a way over the
sûreté
past 4 or 5
physique.
years that we have not
Depuis
seen,
4-5
in
ans, c'est
recent
des
American
questions
history.
qui ne cessent de
This is
devenir de plus
really,
en
I
plus
think,
brûlantes. On n'a
or
pas
at least
vu
for the
ça
past
depuis
50
des
years.
décennies,
So,
depuis au
and
moins
it, I think,
50
has
ans, je
changed a
dirais,
lot
on n'a
about how
pas
we think
connu
about
ça.
institutional life.
Et ça a
Just the fact
changé
that we
pas
have to
mal
worry
comment
about anti-Semitism,
on
that we have to
réfléchit
worry after the events in
sur
Pittsburgh
la
and Poway,
vie
California,
d'institutions
about our own
juives.
physical safety has,
On est
is
inquiet
something
de nos
that in our part
propres
of the world has
sûretés
not always had to be
on
something we
ne
worried about,
connaissait
and all of a
pas
sudden is.
trop ça
And
dans cette
the
partie du
openness of
monde.
our buildings, the security that we need, our
Nos
relationships with
bâtiments
law
ont
enforcement,
besoin
all of that is changing
de
and shifting, and I think
sécurisation.
creating
Tout
some
ça, c'est
complications
en
about our own
mouvement
self-concept
grâce.
of our place
Et
within
je crois
American
que cela a
society.
une
So that's
incidence
just one thing
sur
to have in the back
notre
of our minds, and it's
identité et comment on
related
voit
to the
notre
general
propre
sense of
rôle et
fragility
notre propre
around liberal
statut
democracy
dans
in North
notre
American culture in
société
general, and again,
ambiante.
especially here in America. And the fragility of civility in our civic discourse, the rise of extremism, quite frankly, on both sides of the political spectrum, and
comme vous savez,
also
peut-être, aux
a fragility
États-Unis,
or a weakening of the
un
political center and the
affaiblissement
cultural
d'un
center.
centre politique
And that affects us as
culturel.
Massorti conservative Jews because we also inhabit that space
Nous, en
religiously.
tant que
And in
Juifs
general, that space
Massortis,
in religious life in America is
notre
weakening.
façon de vivre,
That's
c'est
happening in
d'habiter
Christianity.
une
It's happening,
espace de
quite frankly, in
façon
Islam,
religieuse ou
and
spirituelle
it's
aussi.
definitely
Et
happening in the
cet
Jewish world as well.
affaiblissement ou
Orthodoxy is growing
fragilisation,
and in many ways becoming more extreme in
évidemment, ça nous
its
concerne.
beliefs. The
L'orthodoxie
Reform movement
qui
has
vient
really aligned itself with
d'une
the
certaine
political left,
façon plus
in many
extrême,
cases, at least officially,
ou
not always
fondamentaliste,
within individual synagogues and on the
et
ground. And the conservative movement very much inhabits a
va dans l'autre
politically
sens.
centrist space,
Et
both politically, I think, and also
Massorti
religiously,
était
in terms of how it
politiquement
deals with
et
Jewish tradition,
religieusement
balancing tradition and change. And those spaces are
centriste,
very hard to maintain
mais ces
within American culture at a time where the growth
cette
is
situation
either
devient
towards no religion on one side and towards evangelism and a more fundamentalist view of religion on the other side. This space of what I would call a rabbinic space, whether it's in Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, a sense of response to the center, balancing tradition and change is very much, I think, affected and under siege. Finally, to look at what does that mean in terms of Jewish experience.
Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire?
And the changing relationship, and Lisa did a beautiful job of putting that into context, the changing relationship that individuals have to religious experience. She talked about it in terms of the changing relationship to Jewish study, for example, that it's not about what are the basics, but actually how do those basics create meaning for me, and how does that change the way that I live my life. And there are other changes afoot as well. One of the things that Lisa alluded to is that for most of our history as a Massorti conservative movement here in North America, our life is centered around the synagogue. The synagogue was the organizing institution around which we organized our own movement and around which we organized Jewish life. And that is changing. There are plenty of Jewish people and what I call Jewish adjacent people of other backgrounds and religions, but who are connected to us by marriage or by family, and who are interested in some aspect of Jewish life. So both Jews and Jewish adjacent people who are not ready to come into a synagogue at any point in their Jewish life. It used to be that at least around raising children, they often would come into a Jewish space or a synagogue. And now we're finding that that's not even the case. And the only way we're going to have impact is Bashir Husham, if we go and find them. And that's a huge change for us. It's not a change for Chabad, by the way. That's always been one of their hallmarks, is going out and finding Jews wherever they are and bringing them a sense of Judaism and Jewish meaning. It's something we are going to have to learn to do as a Massorti Jewish, conservative community. And that means expanding our reach. It means figuring out how we're going to both continue to strengthen and change synagogues and also move out beyond them to other spaces, and how we're going to use new types of engagement techniques to do that. I'll give an example. Here in the Washington area, we have an organization called The Den, which has a community-based rabbi. What she does is have coffee with dozens and sometimes hundreds of 20 and 30-somethings individually, talks with them, gets to know them, and then connects them into groups to do different kinds of experiences, workshops, and programs around Jewish study and Jewish experience for Shabbat or holidays. It's very time-consuming work, it's very intensive, it's very intimate, and it's using a rabbi in a very different way for us. I think that that's happened a lot more outside of North America than it has here, and it's one of the things that we can start to learn, actually, is how to bring some of those models here to America. Another piece that Lisa touched on and that I'm very interested in, especially around synagogue life, is this idea of hybrid experience. That we used to think of everything happening inside very large synagogue buildings. And now we have to think of the mix between synagogue, home, third spaces like coffee houses, bars, other kinds of cultural spaces, outdoors, and now especially the virtual online experience. And what's our mix of program? Can we do particular experiences in two things at once, three things at once, or do we have to focus on one type of venue at a time? And what's the mix going to be that we offer as synagogue communities or other kinds of institutions? And finally, no conversation about North American Judaism can take place without talking about intermarriage and what it means to fully embrace and welcome people who make lots of different decisions about how they structure their family. And the American context is different in this regard than the Canadian context, and it's quite different than the European context, the Latin American context, and certainly all of us in diaspora have a different experience with this than what's happening in Israel. And we have to think both institutionally in our synagogues and our other organizations how we relate to people who are in partnerships or married to people of other faiths and cultures and backgrounds, and how we're going to welcome them into our spaces. What we have found in our research is that when they are fully welcomed and when they are embraced, they are ready as a family unit or as a couple to engage in Jewish life. They are certainly much more ready than they were if we were to send them in another direction or try to ignore them. And so what we are finding is that they are coming into Jewish life. Often they are keeping a kosher home. They are celebrating Shabbat in one way or another. They are sending their children to religious school. They are, and their children continue to embrace that Jewish experience through experiences on birthright and through other kinds of experiences well into adulthood. Many of them are becoming rabbis and teachers and Jewish professionals and religious leaders in lots of different ways. So we have to think a lot as a community about how we're going to create equal access for them in our Jewish experience. So that's a lot to put on our plate as we're going forward, and we can talk about any of these aspects as we continue sitting together in our living room. Thank you, Adam.
Well, I think we've got everything on the proverbial coffee table. And the question is now to try and understand how these things come together. Listening to both of you present, and you both have such a eagle-eyed view in some way of these issues in the positions that you're in. Some things stood out to me as themes. One of them is certainly about institutions, right? Both of you represent, in a variety of different ways, big institutions, ones with long histories and big bureaucracy, and yet both of you also talked about the challengers to those institutions. I remember being at JTS and seeing the development of HUC-JIR and being a bit sad that something so amazing wasn't actually part of JTS, even though all the rabbis of HUC-JIR graduated from JTS. And that's the theme in many ways. The Jewish Emergent Network is both in and out in many of these institutional spaces and labels. And I think it's something we also are a bit less familiar with in Europe, where there aren't big Jewish institutions with long histories, at least not in our non-Orthodox spaces. Here in the UK, we have the big bloated bureaucracy of the United Synagogue to contend with, but the non-Orthodox communities are much more agile, tend to be much more flexible because they don't have that. So do you see that going in that direction? Is it inevitable that there will just be less of these big institutions, or is it about changing what they do and how they work? Jacob, with your position as being one of the key people in changing two of the largest, I wonder if you can speak first about what you think that looks like.
Jacob?
Well, first of all, I think innovation in all its forms should be celebrated. So the fact that we should see spaces like HUC-JIR and the Jewish Emergent Network and all of these different kinds of things that are being created by folks who have grown up through our movement as huge successes. They are, if we believe in our own ideology of an evolution, of an evolving Judaism that responds to the needs of time and place, then these are the organizations that are doing that, and they should be celebrated, encouraged, funded, and partnered with whenever we can. So that's number one. And number two is they are a reminder that no organization can stay the way it was. All organizations need to change. For large organizations like the Rabbinical Assembly and the USCJ, it means how do we respond to some of the trends that Lisa talked about, for example, the boutique nature of our lives, right? It used to be in the 1950s and 60s, you created one experience that fit everyone. That's how our synagogues are actually here in North America. That's very much how they are organized. You have one or two rabbis to create certain kinds of religious experiences that will meet the needs of 300 families, 500 households, 1,200 households at a time. It was very efficient. It allowed people to pay only a certain amount of money to get a certain type of experience. And now what we're finding is in the age of Amazon and boutique hotels, and where you can get a custom colored object delivered to your house at a certain time on a particular day, that we have to break down our experiences and our organizations into spaces where people feel real connection to one another in smaller spaces. The most successful communities, religious communities in America, by the way, are doing this. The evangelical churches are doing this a lot. We have to think about how to do that too. At the RA, the Rabbinical Assembly, we're doing that by creating affinity groups, small networked groups of colleagues who talk about similar interests, either in life or in religious life or religious leadership. They're getting to know each other and doing work together and getting to be a part of each other's lives. And we're finding that to be very powerful. It can be through study, creating small groups of people who engage in ongoing study together. And our congregations are going to have to do the same. And we're forming those same kinds of cohort-based spaces at the USCJ as well, whether it's around how to introduce music on Shabbat, whether it's around social justice issues, those kinds of spaces. So whatever we can do to break down a very big organization into small spaces is going to be part of what we need to provide.
It's really interesting. Lisa, have you found the same thing at HUC? Also quite an aged and well-respected institution.
Yes, thank you. HUC is a seminary. It's an educational institution, and so our challenges are a little bit different than we're preparing people to go serve the Jewish world. So they're at the very early parts of their careers, or really just beginning. I agree with Jacob. Every institution needs to change, and we among them. We're almost 50 years old as an institution, and that's a lot. And we're very proud of our history, but there's a lot that needs to change, and we're actually in the midst of a very significant strategic planning process right now that will result in some major structural and probably programmatic changes as well. So that's important. And I would also say we very much align ourselves with the reform movement, but we train rabbis and educators and nonprofit professionals to serve the Jewish world. that probably 75%, I would say, of our rabbis in recent years go on to serve in Reform congregations, but a significant number do not. They go into chaplaincy or to organizational work or to educational work or to the emergent network kind of experiences. They become the entrepreneurs on their own. So that is a interesting and growing phenomenon, I think, within our student body. So we need to be responsive to that and to be able to prepare rabbis to both be change makers within legacy institutions and to be change makers in institutions and communities that we haven't yet imagined. So I think both of those are very true. Jacob gave some great examples of the kinds of work that is happening. I would say, and this is the challenge, particularly facing smaller communities that just don't have the resources. And it's great if you are a 1,000 member community and you have 3 clergy members or more, and you can each develop a customized portfolio. If you're a solo rabbi in a community, you have to be everything to everybody, and that is really, really hard. And you don't have the resources. So then that speaks to partnerships and collaboration across institutions, and how do we break down some of the barriers that have existed, by having a building, we're sort of locked into that building. How do we move out of that space of the physical nature of Jewish life and create new ways of connecting?
It's really interesting. One of the things that occurred to me as you were showing, especially with the training of rabbis, is what a big feature for many European communities, the struggle to find a rabbi or for people who are coming from Europe to train as rabbis can be, because there's just simply not the same seminary structures. And I've certainly been seeing, and maybe you have in the last few days, this article from Tablet about all of these different online rabbinical training programs, representing the entire Jewish world, by the way, Orthodox, Massorti, Reform, and it seems like it's growing humongously, more than I realized.
Yes, and Kohenet programs, and you can continue renewal, you can continue across the spectrum of there's something for everybody, which is exciting and also curious. I think it's definitely emblematic of the times that people are looking for their particular way in, and if they're not, and the synagogue is one among many options, and even a synagogue with 15 different choices of affinity groups is not going to be right for everyone.
Indeed, and the rabbi increasingly in the boutique model, who used to serve everyone at the same time, maybe is finding that they're more and more specialized as opposed to being the generalists you mentioned.
And thinking about how we can use networks to help supplement that. I mean, Lisa had a great piece in one of her slides that talked about the strengths that we have locally versus what we could offer by being part of a larger network. So it's one of the things that network organizations like mine, USCJ, the RA, one of the things that we're trying to think about is where do we add value? So for example, we recently here in North America created a program called Scholar Stream, where we connected hundreds of synagogues. The last time was about 130. This time it's around, I think, 50 or 60 synagogues, together with great scholars from the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies in California and the JTS, so that we could, so during COVID, for example, when we really want our rabbis, talking to people at the bedside, getting their families through, calling every one of the people in every one of the households in their congregation, doing that connective network work, not having to prepare a Torah study class. So we said, we could do that centrally, and you're going to be meeting virtually anyway. It's not like they can come to the synagogue and sit down around a table and study together. So let's do that online. So we had over 1,000 people each week for several weeks in the fall, and now we're preparing for the next sessions to start tonight. And tomorrow overnight here in North America. So, you know, so it's just, and so it's interesting. We wonder, you know, to what extent could we continue to provide that kind of high level, high quality study experience, leaving local rabbis to do some of that network experience and things like that. And the great teachers who might still be in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Madison, Wisconsin, we can still bring them online and have them teach not just their own community, but actually the entire continent. So there are so many of these kinds of, you know, so to think about what are the strengths that each rabbi and each community can really provide, and then what are the things that we could provide through technology. That's one of the major reorientations that we need to think about, you know, over the next few months and years.
It's really interesting. In some ways, the fact that we're so decentralized makes it easier to centralize something. It's just the irony of us being together this evening in a way we couldn't be, or wouldn't have been a year ago, right? We could have been, but we wouldn't have. We just, it wouldn't have been expected. So that clearly has already changed. To take us in a slightly different direction, I think it would be, we'd be missing something if we didn't talk a little bit about politics. Because I know certainly here in the UK, and I'm sure across Europe, many people have had their eyes on America with both admiration and revulsion for a great period of time. And you know, one of the things that's very obvious to me in watching my friends and colleagues in the States is that the job of a rabbi and the job of a Jewish community has been so deeply affected by the political mandate to act and to get involved in both sides of the aisle, so to speak. And I wonder if you see that, not what that is, because I think it's apparent, but kind of whether it's a positive, whether that's going to enhance Jewish commitment, or whether that's actually a danger to Jewish commitment.
I'll address it first. I mean, of course, you know, it's not necessarily a yes or a no question or either or, but in general, I see it as an enhancement to Jewish commitment. And I'll tell you a little story, just as a way of illustration. A former student of mine who's been a rabbi in the field now for a dozen years or so, when he was in rabbinical school, before he started rabbinical school, he was a legislative aide for a congressperson from his state. He was sure his rabbinate was going to be about politics completely in all ways. He ended up getting a job as an assistant rabbi in a large congregation, and within 2 or 3 years, he realized he still was very politically oriented, but he realized that the orientation, sort of instead of the outward working, certainly still working on social action and social justice, but he saw it much more as a tool or a means for building community, for building engagement. He said, I don't take people on Habitat for Humanity builds to build a house, in an underserved neighborhood just to build the house, but I take them to do it together as Jews. And that makes a big difference. So we see many congregations and communities very involved in community organizing activities, in mounting campaigns, in collaboration, in partnership with many other congregations, both on the state level and on the federal level. We see both distinguish between social action, which is more like the soup kitchen or the homeless shelter, and the direct service, and social justice, which is moving towards structural change. But people could do that, who are motivated to be involved politically, could do it in many ways, but the synagogue adds value to be able to do that with your community as Jews. And I think that that's a really important piece that the people doing it successfully have already raised up, and we need to be very mindful of it. Politics from the Bima is another matter. And I also like to say that, it might be okay to talk about the documentary hypothesis in a classroom, but are you going to say on Pesach, on the first day of Pesach, that the Exodus didn't happen? Probably not a good idea to say it from the Bima. But so where you say things and how you say them and in what context matters matters a lot. So, and we know, I mean, we have an obligation. I think the rabbinic obligation, part of the core role of a rabbi is to be a moral voice in the world. And our times demand a very articulate and compelling moral voice. How people do that depends a lot on their communities, where they live. But we have plenty of wealth of tradition to draw on to make the points that we need to make about loving the stranger, about pursuing justice, about caring for our world in ways that are essential right now.
Sure.
L'amour de l'étranger.
Sure, of course. Jacob, earlier you said that you saw the conservative movement as being the center, both religiously in some way and politically. Have you found that is at odds with the feelings people have around this type of involvement?
So look, I think one of the things we all have to realize about Masorti conservative Judaism is that no one model fits all. And we have lots of in our history, we have lots of different models around how we engage politically. So we have Rabbi Marshall Meyer, Zichrono Livracha, from Argentina, who his philosophy was what you do during the week gives you the right to celebrate Shabbat, at the end of the week. And the amount that you fight for justice during the week is what allows you to then stop working and celebrate Shabbat with prayer and song. And it's a very powerful model. And in his moment in Argentina, it was needed. And he rallied an entire Jewish community to fight against dictatorship. It's a very powerful story, and I think many of our rabbis throughout the world continue to look to that model as a form of inspiration. Sometimes, however, they find themselves in communities where there isn't that sense of homogeneity, where there's a lot of different political outlooks. Even if they agree on the same values, they may disagree about the policy solutions to making those values real in the world. So then we have to wonder about synagogues as a space for civil conversation, to be able to talk about our values and to understand each other when we act on those values in different ways. And what does that end up looking like? And that can be a more centrist space of coming together and creating relationship. So, there's no one answer. And I think one of the things we need to do in our rabbinic training, as we train our synagogue leaders and our other institutional leaders, is to become very sensitive to what's the community that they're creating, and putting relationships first. In my community, over 20 years, I found that if I had the right relationships, I could then talk about certain political things from my perspective, knowing that people understood that even if they disagreed with me, A, I still loved them, and B, I wanted to hear what they were thinking. But that took a long time to develop those relationships. For a rabbi who comes into a community that's already existing, they can't just come in and all of a sudden think that they're going to be able to do that kind of work. They're going to have to also learn about the different people, find out what they can do as a whole community, what they can do as part of it, in different parts with different parts of the community. It's complex.
Absolutely. But it's really interesting. Yeah, no doubt. It's certainly become something that I've seen take over in some way the conversation in American Jewish life. And that might be a temporary takeover, but no doubt it's something which I think many European Jews see as quite different. There's not the same necessarily political engagement, although it depends on the country, and that's one of the aspects of diversity that we're facing, is that actually every country has different needs. One thing that you both raised that I think is probably very relatable to many Jews, Masorti Jews, especially in Europe, is this idea of do-it-yourself Judaism. Right, a lot of our communities are kind of built from the ground up, from people who just give their time and energy. You've had that experience. You've probably both had that experience of doing that sort of thing. And you mentioned the kind of boutique focus and also technology, which ironically is linked to that. Right, everyone's looking for artisanal approaches to things, authentic approaches, and ironically, perhaps to some, they're going to TikTok and Instagram to find that boutique artisanal approach to it. And it seems like there's something developing about both that skill building that we saw in the 1970s with the Jewish catalog, moving online in some way into these social media spaces, which aren't controlled by institutions, but are completely controlled by whoever is the loudest or has the most followers. And I wonder if that's something that you see as an increasing element of Jewish life, the role of influencers, for lack of a better term, rather than rabbis. And also whether you think that that's a good development.
Si oui, est-ce que vous voyez plus
whoever has a feeling on that, Lisa said you don't know much about TikTok earlier, but no doubt, you know, it's where many Jews are finding their information these
au
days.
lieu des rabbins. Et
yeah, I think that
où est-ce qu'on peut se renseigner ces jours-ci?
You know, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I valued very much the many years that I was a part of a conservative Jewish community was the active involvement of lay leadership in ritual matters, in a lot of different aspects of synagogue life, and that is less the case in most Reform congregations. It's a much more professional orientation, you know, so, and I think that that's a problem. I think the more empowered, the more our people know, the more deeply engaged in Judaism they are, whatever roots they find to get engaged, the better, the richer Jewish life becomes, so that rabbis do not have to be the only influencers, certainly amongst, you know, the various forms of social media, the many podcasts that we have, you know, all of the websites and so on. You know, there's lots and lots of rabbis and cantors and educators who are providing tremendous content, really, really rich content, but they're not the only ones. And I don't see that as a bad thing. I think that what it does, it presents a challenge for me as an educator, you know, somebody who trains rabbis, and I'm sure for Jacob as well, as he's thinking about the community, the existing community, about how do rabbis, how do clergy distinguish themselves and differentiate themselves, and what's the value added, and that's something really important to think about. Now, it's not like, you know, a social worker can't be a really good pastor, or can't be a really good, knowledgeable Jew. I mean, do you need to have smicha to provide pastoral care? You don't need smicha to officiate at a wedding. You know, I mean, there's lots of places where people without the piece of paper or the laying on of hands can do a lot within the Jewish community. And I think overall that's a good thing. But I also don't want it to be a world where rabbis become obsolete. I think the world needs rabbis.
D'un monde où les
certainly I agree.
Obsolète.
Yeah.
Moi,
Although
je
the
suis
world needs
complètement
different
d'accord.
rabbis.
Mais le
rabbis who struggle today are struggling because their sense of authority has in fact changed. That in the 21st century, in post-enlightenment spaces, you know, in liberal democracies, the fact is most authority comes through influence, not through more traditional sense of authority. It may be different in the Orthodox community, where at least theoretically a rabbi says X and that's what the community does, although I think it's actually in reality much more complex in terms of even in our day and age, even what that looks like. Even the most Haredi communities, actually the rabbi has to pay very close attention to what Schefter would call Catholic Israel, right? Like what is Amcha? What are normal people doing, and what are they expecting of their rabbi? They are still political actors, but I would say that in our spaces, a rabbi who thinks of herself as an influencer will actually be much more successful than one who thinks of herself as an authority figure. And that's something I had to come to terms with, quite frankly, very early in my rabbinate. It's not something that I necessarily understood as a model in my rabbinic training. I think it has changed in terms of how we do rabbinic training now. And part of that is because responsibility and authority is shared. And by the way, that is the natural idea behind rabbinic Judaism. The move that the rabbis made from a priesthood to a rabbinate that's democratic and meritocracy based on your ability to study and your ability to have access to texts and ideas, right? That is most in keeping with our understanding of liberal democracy and an enlightenment society. And so, and our brief sort of like time with a Protestant Christian model of an authoritative clergy person, on top of a bima with a very powerful sermon. I think that's actually a misdirection in Jewish history, and we are now coming into a more authentic space of religious life and religious leadership in terms of rabbinic Judaism. So actually, I completely celebrate it, and the more we understand that our job is to empower as many people as possible to engage in Jewish life, Jewish text, Jewish learning, Jewish thinking, the more we can embrace that, and the more we can see ourselves as enablers and people who empower others and not those who can control or have authority over others, the more successful we will be, in terms of growing our movement and strengthening Jewish life. So it's actually a huge opportunity. We should all be on TikTok.
I'm not on TikTok yet, but I found this very receptive audience on Instagram, and someday I might brave TikTok for myself. It's interesting, but both of you guys have actually answered some of the questions that were raised in chat. We've had some great questions. Stuff about fear and worry about this boutique model, about the change in rabbinic leadership. What's that going to mean? Is there going to be a difference between a rabbi and a guru? Is it just kind of blending together in some way, the change in authority? And also, what does it mean to be Jewish when it's so specialized and so boutique in that way? And I think we've addressed lots of those questions. I think in our last few minutes, because we do have to wrap up, and I'm sure we could go on for a very long time. I'd be curious if each of you, in answer to those questions, to a certain extent, about the worry about what these things bring with us, and assuming that what we said at the beginning is true, that we're looking at our future when we look at America here in Europe, what would your advice be for how to respond to the things that are coming our way, and how to make sure that it doesn't mean Judaism is diluted, but actually means enhanced?
I'll go first so Lisa can have the last word. So look, for me, one of my favorite sermons that I ever gave as a rabbi in the pulpit was about guilt. And the thesis of the sermon was that guilt is really helpful because it makes you aware of your faults. But if it paralyzes you from doing something about it, then it's no longer helpful. And it's the same thing with worry and anxiety. Where worry and anxiety, if you can become aware of what is causing that, and it wakes you up to something that we need to do, what the leadership challenge is, it's very helpful. When it leads to paralysis, where you want to just avoid the problem rather than lean into it, then it's no longer useful, and in fact, it's very unhelpful. So our job as leaders in this moment is to pay attention to what's keeping us up at night. That's the beautiful question that community organizers always ask. What's keeping you up at night? What's worrying you? What's creating anxiety? And then the next question is, and what are you going to do about it? Right? Not avoid it, but lean into it. Create a TikTok video, or go out and find 4 other partners who are worried about the same thing you are, and figure out how we're going to make a difference in solving it. So yes, worry and anxiety are very helpful if it moves us towards action and solution.
Somewhat comforting. Lisa, what do you think to wrap us up?
So not so different from what Jacob just had to say. I agree with him, but from a slightly different angle, perhaps. Made me think of the very famous saying from Rabbi Nachman about the whole world is a narrow bridge. It says that's how we know it, how we sing it. The important thing is don't be afraid. But in the original, he said don't be afraid of yourself. Don't make yourself afraid. So how do we grapple with the very real fears that that exist in our world and coming at us from so many different dimensions. You know, how do we cultivate a stance of courage, of optimism? I think that's one of the gifts that we as rabbinic leaders need to cultivate and bring to the world, is the possibility of hope, of a better future. You know, it's a messianic vision. You know, we have it in our sources, that we can make this world better for ourselves, for our loved ones, for the next generation. And the important thing,
les générations à venir.
That's certainly good advice. Yes, indeed. It's nice to end on a positive note, looking towards our future and yours. Certainly we have more in common than we do different, especially these days, as tonight has demonstrated. And I want to thank you for joining me in my living room here in St. Albans, and hand it back to Rabbi Wiener to close us off this evening. But thank you to both of you for taking the time out of your afternoons to share with us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Okay, so I also owe a huge thank you. You've come all the way from across the Atlantic in order to share your wisdom with us. And I was just reflecting, first of all, you blew my mind with the ideas and the analysis, but crossed my mind this why do you do it? You do it because of our sense of Am Yisrael, that we're not just some people over there in Europe, but this sense of the Jewish people and our commitment to the Jewish people, of your commitment to the Jewish people. And I want to thank you for taking of your time and to share it with another part of Am Yisrael, and really Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh and we're all one, and I feel that unity as we share together this evening. I just want to take the last few minutes that I have to talk about the next session. The next session is going to be in 2 weeks' time, and in many ways follows on from what we were talking about this evening. One of the ideas that our speaker shared with us is the idea that there are new spaces, there are new ways that people are organizing, and our theme in 2 weeks' time is what I call the new communities, the new religious communities. And we're looking at a series of grassroots organizations and communities that are rising in various places around Europe and in all the places around Europe. And we're trying to understand who they are and what they're doing. By definition, they're non-denominational. So we're not particularly looking at Massorti communities, but we're looking at people who are very much an increasing part of the Jewish environment around us. The 4 organizations we're going to be looking at is Moshe House, the Partnership Minyanim, which is growing on the left wing of the Orthodox world, an organization called Base Berlin, which is a grassroots organization, a religious community by its name, you can tell, in Berlin. And finally, a group of people who have created what I call Zoom Shabbat, and we'll be asking each of these organizations, who are they? What are they doing? What lack in the Jewish establishment are they trying to address? And what is their vision for the future? And we want to bring all of them together to help us ponder, really to understand the competition, really to understand what's happening in the world around us, and really to help us think in a better informed manner on what our future is going to be looking like. So I want to thank everyone for taking an hour of the evening this evening and sharing it with us. I want to thank our speakers, and I look forward to seeing as many of us as possible in 2 weeks' time when we return to learn about the new religious communities. So good evening to everyone, and look forward to seeing you again.
Et bonne soirée à tout le monde. J'espère vous retrouver bientôt et merci encore à tous nos intervenants.